Support for WBFO and What's Next comes from our members and from Health Foundation for Western and Central New York, where racial and socioeconomic health equity are prioritized. Learn more about building healthier neighborhoods at hfwcny.org.
This is What's Next, an hour dedicated to amplifying the voices of marginalized and underrepresented communities across Western New York and Southern Ontario.
We cannot erase, we cannot reform, we cannot make things better if we're uncomfortable having tough conversations, if we're uncomfortable talking about race.
What's Next carries forward our mission to engage in meaningful conversations about race, equity, and the shared concerns that deeply affect Buffalo's East Side and beyond.
Don't stop. Make those families part of your life. Their lives are part of yours. Don't stop.
Together, we dive into the real issues, striving for understanding, connection, and change.
In the suburban area, everywhere, we must work and teach our children.
And welcome back to What's Next. My name is Ekua Mends-Aidoo, and I am here with Jay Moran, and we are your hosts today. We are very excited. We have three lovely guests who are joining us this morning, and we're talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre. It was a documentary from the Buffalo History Museum, and it's called A Shot Rang Out. We are here with Dr. Barbara Seals-Nevergold, an esteemed educator, historian, and community leader, Tala Harden of Telegraphy, and Lauren Kausner, Director of Public Programming at the Buffalo History Museum. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to just first start off by talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre. It's one of the most devastating events in American history, yet so many people don't know about it, right? How did y'all get to this point in wanting to tell this story? And there's a very specific connection in Buffalo that we'll also uncover as well.
Sure. Well, I guess I'll start because I have been doing research on an individual by the name of Andrew Jackson Smitherman. And Mr. Smitherman was a journalist. And he was a publisher of a paper called the Tulsa Star, which he began to publish in Tulsa in 1914 until the massacre in 1921. And so the connection that brought me to Mr. Smitherman was someone who from Oklahoma who at one time that I met who indicated that there was a man who came to Buffalo who had some significance with the massacre. His name was Andrew Jackson Smitherman. And that was about all that she said, but that was enough to spark my interest, one, in Mr. Smitherman, and then, of course, if you're interested in the history of Mr. Smitherman, you can't ignore the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated about process, especially when it comes to historical work like this. Mm-hmm. How did you go about, like you said, you only heard a name, connection to Tulsa. Right. How did you build from there?
It actually took me a couple years before I really came back and decided to do some work on Mr. Smitherman. And I started looking in the newspapers and, of course, not really, knowing that or if there were copies of the Tulsa Star still available. I just really started researching and found that there were copies of a paper called the Buffalo Star here in Buffalo, New York. And that was Mr. Smitherman's paper that he started once he got here. So beginning to look at the Buffalo Star and the history that Mr. Smitherman made, where he did not really talk about his experience in Tulsa, but I couldn't ignore the fact that the basis of his life, the foundation, was in Oklahoma. So I began to go back and extend the research into Oklahoma newspapers. And of course, knowing that he was connected, and the reason he wound up ultimately in Buffalo was because he had to leave Oklahoma after the massacre, that I began to research his experience and his role in the massacre. And so I know, like I mentioned before, a lot of folks don't know this story. When we think about the Tulsa Race Massacre and when it happened, why it happened, can you just give a little glimpse of that specific history and talk a little bit about why, this was really important? Well, people talk about the Black Wall Street a lot having to do with Tulsa because it was a very active and I would say affluent Black community in Tulsa in the early 1900s. The section of Tulsa called Greenwood. Greenwood, thank you. Called Greenwood. There were businesses, there were professionals, doctors, lawyers, and of course Mr. Smitherman and his newspaper there in Tulsa. And the Race Massacre began because of an alleged assault by a black man, a young black man called Dick Rawlin, who supposedly tried to assault a white girl in an elevator in an office building in downtown Tulsa. He was arrested. He was placed in jail, and because of the fervor around the story beginning to spread throughout the city, a group of white men began to collect and to threaten Dick Rawlin outside of the prison, the jail where he was being held. A group of black men offered their services actually to the sheriff to help protect Dick Rawlin from any kind of lynching possibility. And remember, again, this is the 1920s, early 1900s, where lynching was frequent. Not only men who were lynched, but also black women. And a lot of people don't understand that black women and children were lynched as well. So those black men had a reason to be concerned for Dick Rawlin's safety. And the sheriff said, we've got this. We don't need to have this help. Those men, the group of men left, but the group of whites who were menacing Dick Rawlin and surrounding the jail began to grow even more and become more agitated and more threatening. The black men went back again to offer their services to help protect this young man. And many of them had arms, they had weapons, because they'd been in World War I. And they, had fought to defend America. When they came home with experience, they came home with their weaponry, and they came home with an attitude that if we can fight for America on foreign soil, why wouldn't we want to protect our young men here and ourselves here, in our own country? Somehow, and I want to say somehow, there's never been, I guess, an exact accounting as to what happened, but someone tried to take a gun away from one of the black men. That didn't happen, and as Tala so aptly named this documentary, and a shot rang out, and then all hell broke loose. And that's to quote the sheriff at the time, and that began the riot on the night of May 31st, 1921.
Yeah, I have to be honest. I think it was maybe 10 years ago when I first heard about the massacre in Tulsa. And I'm kind of curious about everybody else here and how it came to you. And let's also, for that, let's talk to the people who don't understand. If I'm not going to say that I'm old, but I'm pretty old. And if it was only 10 years ago that I really kind of became understanding of it, I'm sure we find other people around here. What about that? Let's talk about what happened.
Sure. Well, I was the digital media specialist at the Buffalo History Museum, and one of the projects that I was working on was just creating social media content that looked at Buffalo's history as well as modern day history. So our librarian has a calendar called On This Day in History, and one date that came it kind of just stood out to me was the death of Andrew Smitherman, newspaper publisher, and then it mentioned something about a massacre. And the director of communications at the time, Brian Hayden, he led me to Dr. Nevergold and said, she knows so much about this. You should ask her more. We can craft a great social media story about this. And it was supposed to be like a 10-minute video at most, just like a quick interview. But as Dr. Nevergold kept speaking, I realized I knew nothing about this massacre at all. I knew nothing of Black Wall Street. I mean, I've heard of it. I've witnessed parts of it as it's making its resurgence now, but I did not know that that was something that was deliberately destroyed. So as we continued to work together, I decided that another step would be to go to Tulsa and ask the Tulsa residents, do you know about this massacre? And when I got to Tulsa, a lot of people said, oh, I don't know about it. We don't talk about it. It's something that we don't discuss. We never learned about it in school. That came up a lot. So that changed the documentary a little bit, kind of just saying, why don't we know about this? Why don't we know about Black Wall Street? Why don't we know about the Tulsa Race Massacre? Even to the point that Dr. Nevergold mentions, they don't always say massacre. Sometimes it's race riot, and there is a difference between those.
Of course.
So that was my interest into it. But then also finding out that there was a connection to Buffalo made it go, well, now we have a full story here.
How about for you, Lauren? I'm curious for you.
I used to teach AP history, and I don't remember ever discussing this incident. I remember discussing other similar incidents, but I don't remember ever covering that, and didn't really have very much knowledge of it myself.
Yeah.
Can I say one thing with regard to the fact that the evidence or the information about the massacre was certainly hidden for very long. But the person that sparked the interest in me was a woman by the name of Eddie Faye Gates. And she was a history teacher, retired. And we brought her, the Uncrowned Queens, Dr. Peggy Brooks Bertram, and I brought her to Buffalo for a conference we had in 2004, I think. And she talked about, and as a matter of fact, she had written about the race massacre at that point. But she also was on a commission that had been established by the state of Oklahoma at that time to study the race massacre. And she had, as her role in that commission, had headed up a task force or a committee, subcommittee, that interviewed survivors of the massacre. So that was her role. She had interviewed maybe over 100 survivors. Many of them had been children at the time, but some were teenagers, and so their memories were still there. And that's kind of how I learned again about Mr. Smitherman, was through that work. So the state of Oklahoma was already beginning to go back and make that history better known, and to research that history, and to take ownership of the fact that, the massacre had happened and the massacre had been hidden, and now it was time to uncover it and to really make sure that the world was aware of what had happened.
And I think that's a great question in terms of how folks come to this type of information. This is one incident, right, that had a major impact in that community and across across the country. But then I can think of things like Rosewood, right? And I think it was Florida where a similar incident happened. Emmett Till is another story, and I think that has come out even more because Carolyn Bryant, who was the woman who accused Emmett Till of harassing her, came out in 2017 that she lied about it, right? And she passed away in 2023. And so when I think about these stories and the importance of knowing our history, when I think about the documentary, we talk about that and how this history isn't passed on to the next generation. And so just want to get some insight into, Tala, you brought this story around like social media, and that's a way that a lot of younger people get information. Yeah. What was the importance of, I guess, like taking it from that idea and then bringing it out to this documentary?
I love film. I have a background in film, and it was something that I decided to go into because I thought that was a better way of educating. I have a younger brother who has developmental disabilities, so he learns a lot through visual media. And I grew up learning that was a great way to communicate with people who struggle with other forms of media. So when it came down to this project, I figured not only a documentary would help educate people, but you could see the different perspectives, you could hear them as well. Whether it's just like you're watching just like the B-roll of Tulsa, or you're listening to Dr. Nevergold's narration, there's a lot that went into it as far as making sure that our history will not be erased. It can't be forgotten. No matter what we do, it's going to come and resurface again. So this is my small way of kind of adding to that history, saying like, this is my contribution. You can visually see it, and you also can't say no to it. Like, these are real facts. These are real people. The family has even reached out too, so there will be an extension to the documentary where the family gives their perspective about this as well. And I think that is just essential for the younger generation. Like, if we're going to sit down and watch content, it might as well be educational content that we can use to make decisions about our future, because now it is on us to create what is going to be America in these next few years, few decades. So if this is what I can do to help that, I'm glad to do that.
And back to the Buffalo connection to Tulsa, I'm also curious about Mr. Smitherman. You have the Tulsa Star, came here, of course, with the Star in Buffalo. But did he have firsthand or primary accounts of the massacre and the Tulsa Star? Do we know that? Or
Yeah, that's been something that I've been trying to trace down, and apparently, and he did not talk about the race massacre and his role in it to many people in Buffalo, or maybe to any people in Buffalo. I think it was fairly quiet about that, he wrote in 1960. He began to write a serialized version of his memoirs. And so when I uncovered that, it was like, oh my gosh, what a treasure. So he got through 30 some odd segments, beginning, from his early childhood and adulthood into his experiences in Tulsa, starting the Star and what he had done there. As I said, he did about 34 installments. He died writing at his desk. He had a massive heart attack as he was writing another installment of his memoirs. And so he didn't get to the Tulsa Race Massacre. He didn't get to that period before he died. But he did leave a poem, a very extensive poem called the Tulsa Race Riot and Massacre, which he wrote in 1921. And the poem is a very vivid description of the fighting that went on. It's a vivid description of what his family went through because he wasn't home. His wife and his children, he had 4 children, I think, at the time, got up from their home when they heard the shooting and the yelling and the invasion of the whites who were rummaging and pillaging through that community. And they went into the basement, and they heard men come into their home, trashing it, stealing things, and then they set it afire. And so there's a vivid recreation of what Mom and the children were experiencing during that time, during that part of the invasion. So that's the most that I have found of his writing to document, what happened and his role in the massacre.
And so when you, talk about the story in the documentary, you mentioned expunging his record, right, and going through that process. And I just wanted to get some insight into, how you came about that decision to, write to the district attorney, I believe, and to go through that process.
Yeah, in 2007 or so, Oklahoma was celebrating its centennial as a state. And because of research that I was doing on Mr. Smitherman and my colleague, Dr. Bertram, was doing on Drusilla Dungy Houston, we decided to apply to become a project in that centennial in 2007. And we did get approval and get funding to replicate Uncrowned Queens in Oklahoma in 2007. So we were doing a lot of traveling back and forth. We went to Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and so forth. And I got to meet a number, other than Eddie Faye Gates, others in Tulsa who were working on this. And it just occurred to me, knowing more about Mr. Smitherman and how he had resurrected himself, like the phoenix rising from the ashes. And this man had resurrected himself and become very contributing and accomplished and productive member of our community, that it's time to, take a look at his record and see about clearing it. And so I decided that I would write the county attorney, the district attorney, and I thought, well, what do I have to lose? So I did, and he took it seriously and looked at all of the records and said, it's time, there are 55 men, it's time that we expunge everyone's record.
Wow.
Lauren Kausner, you've been sitting over there quietly this morning with us. When it comes to history, there's so much to choose from, right? I mean, when it comes to Buffalo, there's no end of topics and subjects.
Right.
The importance of pursuing this particular subject.
Yeah, our museum's been around since 1862, and we know that there's a lot of holes in what we have in terms of a collection, in terms of stories that we've told, programs that we've done in the past. So I think it's we're working very hard to include those stories that should be included and that maybe have been excluded in the past. You know, I always, as a teacher, I always felt like you understand yourself better when you understand your own past. As a community, you understand your community better when you know the past. You can't know that if you don't know it, if you don't know what's people have really been through and experienced. So it's a very important story. I mean, I think it was exciting to see Tala, you know, really just like get into it and get excited about it. So we were excited to have her premiere her documentary at the museum. But yeah.
And there's like a generational connection that you mentioned, right, in terms of knowing your history and how when you know your history, you're not doomed to repeat it. And that was a message that was carried throughout the documentary as well. And so, you know, we're in a day and age right now where there are a lot of questions in terms of whose history should be told, whose history shouldn't be told. And I think as a young person, if you're not having that connection to history, anybody could tell you what your history looks like. And so can you just talk a little bit, I guess, you know, about that importance and why, you know, telling those stories help to build not only confidence in yourself, but, you know, understanding your history so you're not doomed to repeat it again.
Don't all jump in at once.
Well, I guess that's one of the things I love about the museum, working there. I've been working there for a year and a half now, so I'm pretty new, but I love to see all the different people who go to the research library and have access to all these different stories about their own past, things that have happened in Buffalo. So I love that we can be a resource for anyone, you know, to walk in and understand more about their past. And Tala mentioned Cynthia. She's been the librarian there for many years. I don't know exactly how many. I think over 15, right?
Yeah, I'd say like 18.
And she is just this wealth of knowledge. But I guess I see the museum as being this place where we've stored all these things, and we're hoping that access to people can help make those histories known.
And I will say Cynthia was a huge support when it came to this documentary. When I first mentioned Andrew Smitherman, she was like, oh my gosh, I've been waiting for someone to talk about that.
She did. She was so excited about it.
And then she even connected me with Ishmael Reed, who was an author from Buffalo, and he worked with Andrew Smitherman. So there was another connection there. We got to bring back that perspective. So Cynthia was an amazing resource to use. I definitely recommend her to anybody who has questions, because she goes above and beyond, but she also has such a respect for history and for Buffalo and for how much of a sacred and unique city we are, I think. So she's one who can capture love and research and put that into one and make you excited to learn history.
And back to, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh,
go right ahead, please.
And I think we talked about history being instructive, you know, teaching us about the past so we don't repeat it, or so that if we do repeat it, you know, we are more prepared to address it. But I also see it as inspirational.
Okay.
And so, you know, not only Andrew Smitherman, but the hundreds of people who were impacted by that massacre, whose homes were destroyed, who were displaced, you know, their histories are inspirational because they kept going, because they rebuilt, because they, you know, again, re-energized the community as much as they could. So in spite of, or despite of the tragedy, there was that element of human resiliency. And so that's a message that I think we want to get across to young people. And, you know, I see this history as, you know, American history. I see this history as important to tell children who are not African American as to tell children who are African American. So that for me is another element of the history that I think is important to elevate.
Absolutely.
And just one more question before we go to break here, Dr. Nevergold, about Andrew Jackson Smitherman. It's intriguing to hear that he leaves Tulsa and the Star after this massacre, and he ends up coming to Buffalo, and he picks up kind of where he left off, right? I mean, as you were doing your research, do you sense in his words this burning desire, commitment, vocation, whatever you want to call it, to record history and to, perhaps maybe even bring literary art to history as well?
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, I use the term resilient just now. I think he was a very resilient individual. He didn't come to Buffalo right away. He went to Boston and then to Springfield, Massachusetts for a year or so, and tried to start a paper there before coming to Buffalo in 1925. But, one of the poems, he was a poet. I mentioned his epic poem, but one of the expressions of what he said when people have a problem or are dealing with a problem, he tells them, when you come to the end of your rope, tie a knot in it and hang on. So that was his.
I might post that right here in this room.
I just think it's relevant today, right. Even. Of course. So that's another piece of the history that is important. The relevancy that continues again from era to era. We can find those examples in many of the historical stories that we have.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Public media is your gateway to discovery. From investigative journalism on Frontline to live local performances on WNED Classical and tiny stage sessions from WBFO The Bridge, Buffalo Toronto Public Media connects you to the stories, music, and moments that matter most. Explore what we have to offer at WNED.org. This is Public Media.
This is Jack Cruiser with the scoreboard on WBFO. Listen during Morning Edition and All Things Considered each Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the latest on pro matchups and college rivalries, as well as standout local athletes from Western New York and Southern Ontario. Want more? Listen to a longer version of the scoreboard at WBFO.org or wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the WBFO app and we'll work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@wbfo.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
And we are back with What's Next. And we're discussing A Shot Rang Out, which is a Tulsa Massacre documentary. And so, Dr. Nevergold, you started to talk about just the connection to history, but then also with the story, right? And when we think about Andrew Smitherman, there was something in the documentary that mentioned like 3 things that he wanted people to connect to, right? And that was the first one was just about the compassion, having compassion for people who were displaced because of it. Also talking about some of the guilt that existed after as well. And I think the last one was just maybe a connection, a deeper connection, or?
Well, it had to do with a particular anti-lynching bill.
Okay.
The federal anti-lynching bill. Do
you want to talk a little bit more about that piece?
Yeah. When he was in Boston shortly after the massacre, somewhere in December or so of 1921, he wrote this extensive article talking about the massacre, and I wish at this point I had the title of it, but it's not here. But at any rate, he wrote this article, and he talked about the purpose of the article, and as you said, one was to kind of expose the guilt, of those who had burned and killed actually many people during that massacre. He talked about wanting to make sure that that people understood and were compassionate and, in a sense, were ready to give reparations to the individuals who were displaced because of the massacre, because, again, many had lost everything. And so he thought that there should be funds that were accumulated for them. And then the third thing I think that I talked about was that there was a federal bill that was proposed, the Dyer bill, and that was not passed until 2023, as the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill. So you brought up Emmett Till earlier. So again, here we are coming in kind of a circle back to Tulsa and back to Mr. Smitherman and his thinking. But those were the things that he wanted to impress the world about, not just the community of Tulsa or the state of Oklahoma or the country. He thought this was really a global issue.
Yeah.
Tala, let's talk about producing a documentary. I mean, this is, it's got to be, a painstaking and very long and a process, and one that takes a lot of passion and a lot of commitment. Just take us through how it all came about, and, maybe take us through a couple of those points where we're like, why am I doing this? No, just kidding.
Oh, yeah. No,
right.
I mean, definitely. I think anybody who sits down and edits a project kind of gets through that, especially when it's a longer project and you're spending hours getting only a couple of seconds done. But it's just, there have been so many stories that have been, I don't want to say lost to history, but just kind of a little bit faded out of the way. And reading about this one it's just the tip of the iceberg with so many stories that are going to follow this. I've had a lot of inspiration along the way from other people, a lot of elders in the community, just encouraging us to hold on to this history, learn about it, embrace it. And the way that I like to do things, like I said, is through film. The process started off, like I said, it was just supposed to be a quick social media video. But then the interview that I did with Dr. Nevergold, it was so good that it was one of those things that I kept digging, I kept wanting to learn more. And the more I found out, the more I was like, there's got to be more added to this. So it's going to be 15-minute piece, 20-minute piece. And now it's almost 30 minutes. And there's still going to be more added into it. But the process was basically the interview with Dr. Nevergold. I sat down, I listened to it a few times. I took certain pieces of the story that I thought would really tie together. And then the thought and opportunity came up to go to Tulsa. And when I was there, it really became about memorializing the history that's down there. Talking to some of the residents, including some of the descendants of Black Wall Street, there's such a need and importance for this to be remembered. A lot of people see Tulsa as kind of like a Buffalo, where there's so much potential in our city, but we need to also embrace the history that comes with that potential. So when I was down there, I took the time to really listen and understand the ground, and then walking the path of where Black Wall Street was and seeing the destruction, seeing some of the bricks that are still left over from the massacre itself, it hit. I would say there is kind of a spiritual nature on that ground too. There's so much power still that's left behind there. The art that's down there too, the murals that they have done, they just speak so loudly of Black excellence and the power that it took to try and destroy that. It was not destroyed. Black excellence is still here, but there were so many efforts to destroy that. And I think it's happening again. As soon as we find something that's powerful and natural, we want to destroy it. We don't amplify the greatness that comes with certain people. We want to just hush that down. So this documentary was a process to make sure that Andrew Smitherman is not forgotten to history, to make sure that the Tulsa Race Massacre is not forgotten to history, and that Black excellence survives and is resilient through time and time again. So that was the main goal in the process of that, is making sure that every single second that's poured into this documentary is about memorializing the excellence that came with Black Wall Street.
And there were so many nuggets in the documentary, too, because I think one of the last quotes came from William Trotter, right? Yes. Who also had a connection to the area in terms of the Niagara movement, right? And the connection there as well. And so folks don't understand where, the Niagara movement that then led to the NAACP all started right in our backyard, right? And so can we just maybe talk a little bit about that connection and, how I think Andrew Smitherman and William Trotter, they knew each other, obviously, back then as well.
Yes. Well, we had an exposition in Buffalo in 1901, the Pan American Exposition. And at that time, in terms of the African Americans, the whole premise of the Pan Am was to talk about all of the accomplishments and the achievements and the modernization that was occurring in the country and in the world. But when it came to the African Americans, the only exhibits that were going to be at the fair were the old plantation and Darkest Africa, stereotypic at best. And a group of Black women, the Phyllis Wheatley Club, held a protest rally to bring the Negro exhibit to Buffalo, which then expressed all of the accomplishments that Blacks had made since emancipation 30 years previously. Who created that exhibit? W.E.B. Du Bois. All right. So I made the connection that Du Bois, knowing Buffalo, knowing the sentiment and the advocacy of people in Buffalo for their rights, reached out to Buffalonians, to Mary B. Talbert and her husband, William, when he was thinking of setting up the Niagara movement and was looking for a place to meet. And there is information that occurred, and that the first meeting of the Niagara movement occurred at Mary Talbert's home. Now, one thing I want to make clear is my friend, Dr. Lillian Williams, and I, continue to sound the bell that Mary Talbert was not a member of the Niagara movement in 1905 because they didn't allow women at all.
Yeah.
And William Trotter was one of those men, 29 men that came to Western New York, to Buffalo, and then they went over to Fort Erie, Canada, where they established the Declaration of Rights proposed by the Niagara movement. So again, the connections are there.
Right.
We have to work some time to uncover them and to document them, but the connections are there because it was a relatively small group of people,
Right.
Who were in the struggle, and they needed to work together and collaborate in order to bring power and strength to what they were doing.
I'm going to open this up, and I'll let anybody who wants to take this, because it's a kind of one of these general questions, but I think it's an important question. And I think with three people who have are so steeped and invested in history, I think it might be a chance to explore this a little bit. I would suggest that in the country right now, our country, that there maybe is a little bit of a pushback against certain history and the certain history of specific people. And I'm wondering if A, you see that, and B, how you think this, again, we can only speculate to a certain extent, but if, how this might affect the country, and perhaps maybe what an individual can do to perhaps make sure that history isn't forgotten. Who wants to take that one? I know it's, and I know, like I said, all three of you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll say just acknowledging goes a long way, at least acknowledging that there is a problem, that there could be a solution, that we have to work towards it, and then being okay with being uncomfortable, because it's not going to last forever. Like, if we start to do the work now, it's not going to last forever. We're going to get to a point where it's going to be better. But a lot of the times, I think a lot of people are privileged with not having to deal with certain things every day. So that creates this narrative in their head that nothing is wrong. And then when someone comes in with a grievance, they're like, well, I'm sure it's not that bad. And then it starts to minimize the problem more and more. And it's not just with African American people or with people of color in general. It's a day-to-day life thing. So just kind of acknowledging that we're not all going through the exact same thing. We're all going to go through things at different times. But also there is a problem that we need to acknowledge, and then we need to be uncomfortable while we're trying to create a solution.
Yeah, I think there's a misunderstanding, perhaps, that in order for one group to expound on its history requires another group to feel that their history is being put down and that they are being dishonored, or somehow their history is being disavowed because looking at the history and telling the truth is difficult to hear. And you just have to point to the 1619 Project and the fact that that has engendered so much anger and pushback and belief that looking at the history and documenting the history from the perspective, not just the perspective of African Americans, but the perspective of the actual history. What happened? There's not an attempt to and I'm sorry, I can't find the word at this point.
It's fine.
But, my belief is that, yes, there is a pushback toward telling the truth about historical significant events, because there is a belief that if you do that, that demeans another group of people. So we have to work very hard, I think, at saying, no, the history happened. There's no reason for you in 2024 to feel that you are less, or you are embarrassed, or you are being blamed for something that happened in 1619. But the truth is, this is the way people interacted. This is the result of that interaction that we call history.
I think that's a really good way to put it, because I think it's true. You get defensive of, your story and your history. So if you feel like another story's being told, it's hard not to maybe have a knee-jerk reaction. And I think as a museum, we do see that. And I think
you get that kind of feedback from patrons, or
at times,
observers. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And it makes me think of the Erie Canal exhibit that we're in the process of putting together, that Dr. Nevergold has been a part of too. And I guess I see the museum just persisting. Like, we just have to keep that. The mission is there, and we just have to keep true to it. It is our mission to include diverse perspectives. And so that is, when that exhibit's up, you're going to see that. And we just have to stay committed to that mission.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so I know the story is really deep, and I think for some folks this might be their first time even hearing about the massacre at all. And so, where can people find more information or maybe access this documentary?
It has not been fully published yet,
Okay.
Mainly because there has been a lot of reach out from the family. So that gave me a second to kind of say, we can shape this a little bit more before it's fully published and ready to be on display. But as Dr. Nevergold brought up that the anniversary is May 31st, I think probably having a screening which shows the full story around that time would be the best thing. And then after that, they'll be able to find it on, we'll make a website for it, and probably on YouTube, just like the general places. We haven't figured out just yet like how we're gonna actually like really push this out there, but I do think that a lot of schools have started to reach out. There have been other places that want us just to screen it and have conversations. I think that's the best way to start, kind of starting small and then working our way up.
Awesome. And we're going to take just another quick break, and we'll be right back.
Our mission at Buffalo Toronto Public Media is to serve our local community. And on WBFO, we do that by keeping you informed. We bring you important perspectives from your neighbors on what's next.
It's cultural heritage tourism. People go and they travel different places to learn about history and lived experiences that only took place in that area. Oftentimes you may have people in certain positions that don't understand the value of cultural heritage tourism.
And we investigate issues in our community, such as racial disparities in traffic stops.
The data breakdown by council district shows that black people are stopped disproportionately to their population in all 9 districts. Lovejoy District leads the pack in terms of those disproportionate stops. Just 37% of the district's population is black, yet black motorists account for almost 70% of stop receipts issued there.
This is public media.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@wbfo.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
And we are back with What's Next. I'm Ekua Mends-Aidoo with Jay Moran, and we're talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And before we broke for a break, we started to talk about more of the connection, right, in terms of why this was an important story to tell. In the documentary itself, there's a connection, again, to Buffalo, right, and the massacre that happened on May 14th in 2022. And so, obviously talking about the connection and what happened in Tulsa, but then, hey, it happened again, right? And so what was the importance of bringing that story to light in the documentary itself?
I will say for that one, during my time at the Buffalo History Museum, I was able to join the 514 Memory Coalition. And through hearing the stories, through understanding how we're collecting the memories that happen on these occasions. It's not just 514 that we talked about. We talked about Uvalde and Orlando as well. those are issues that continue to happen in this country. And the way that it happened in Buffalo was very, very deliberate. And it was a massacre. It was just a hateful act that we cannot forget. But for a lot of people in the Buffalo community, they can turn away and look away from the East Side. The East Side is still struggling. There are still struggles that have happened way before 514 that will continue to happen until these matters are addressed. I think it's important just to kind of show that the way that we suffered and the way that we come back is very strong too. Tulsa came back in a different way. Their destruction was very different, but like Dr. Nevergold said, the resiliency was there, and it showed through different people like Mr. Smitherman. The way that Buffalo has reacted is the same way. The resiliency that comes out of this is amazing. Whether it's a poem from Jillian Hainsworth or just somebody taking the time just to sit there at the memorial and pay their respects, there are so many different ways that Buffalo shows that they care. And when we show up and we show out, like, that's something that I want people to remember, and that's why our city is very important. But that's also something that, like, when I was in Tulsa, I remember I was looking for like an easy visual connection, and there was a buffalo, but it said Tulsa in it instead. Oh, wow. And I was like, see, there's connections all around somewhere. Like, sometimes you just have to look and see it, but other times it finds you. And when I was in Tulsa, I was reminded of 514, of making sure that we don't let these things happen again, but we also don't forget what happens, that when if they do happen again, we just have like these collective pockets where we can just keep saying, like, these things happen. We need to do something to stop it. Right. So what happened in 1921 and what happened in 2022, eerily similar.
Yeah.
I'm going to follow up with that to you, Dr. Nevergold, because you've held a lot of positions in this community, of course, school board president as well. I want your perspective on 514. Is this community, and I'm talking about the whole community, long beyond the outside, the East Side, is it recognizing, is it still honoring those victims?
I think that there are times when I feel that they are, and that's usually, around that significant date or a significant individual. But to the extent that, Tala mentioned going to Tulsa, and this point in time, I already mentioned that the state established a commission. The commission is still alive and still working, operating, and they changed the name of the commission at some point to the Tulsa Race Riot and Massacre Commission, and then they changed it to Massacre only. So that the state has been actively, and people have been actively addressing the massacre and the history, etc., for many years now, for at least a quarter of a century. And yet, Tala mentioned all of the people that she spoke to, young people who didn't know about the massacre. That could happen here as well. So I think the importance of really ensuring that the memory is maintained, the memory is collected, the memory is available, and we're doing that in terms of oral histories. We're doing that in terms of recognitions of, again, programs like this that make sure, again, that the community doesn't forget what happened on May 14th, 2022. So it takes work, I guess. The bottom line is you have to continue to work. You have to continue to be vigilant and to address this when you find that we're in danger of perhaps losing perspective and losing memory about what happened and why it happened and how it impacted this community and how it continues to impact the community in ways that very often we don't understand or we aren't, aware of. It's not as visible.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, what ways we can really do that. I have a friend in Memphis, Tennessee, and the day that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, he works in county government. They don't work that day, right? I think there are some nonprofit organizations. I know Say Yes, for instance. May 14th is a day that is, held to memorialize and think about what happened as well. And maybe other organizations might consider things like that. How do we hold this history higher, so folks continue to pay attention? And what other ways do you think we could do to really preserve that specific date in mind?
Yeah, I think as you just mentioned, certainly addressing the date and the event itself on that particular date, and not again allowing it to fade into history and fade into someone's memory. That as I said, it takes action. It takes a deliberate, and I think we have to be deliberate in how we address that memory.
Yeah.
And just like an Uncrowned Queen says, like, say their names, honor their legacies. That's
yes.
what I like. I always love the name of that exhibit just because it is as simple as that. It's honoring their legacy. It's saying their name.
No, put a tough question to you then, Lauren. So what works in this way? We talk about being deliberate, finding ways to make sure that this date is not forgotten. What works in those regards? What do you see are the possibilities?
Well, I'm not involved with the 514, meetings and things
Right.
like that. So I'm less knowledgeable about exactly what's going on. But I know that the museum really wanted to be a part of collecting that, if that was okay with the families, to be a part of collecting, knowing that this building's been around or this institution's been around for so long, they could promise to preserve all those things. I think that's really important, that knowing that the things that have been collected and the stories that are being collected will always be there. I think that's important. So I think that's one way the museum can help. In addition to, displaying those items at times or when that's appropriate. But
yeah, I know the museum. I mean, I don't think you were at the museum when the collection was taking place, but there was an effort to collect a lot of these wonderful, makeshift memorials that were placed over at Tops.
Right.
The museum has most of those still.
I don't know if the word most, because
Okay.
I don't
I
know
wanna be
enough
careful
about it,
about
but
that.
I
Yeah.
know we have
Thank
a
you.
lot of things
Sure,
from,
okay.
They're over at the
from
Research
that.
Center, I will
Yes,
say.
yeah. There's a
Yeah.
huge space, and they're going through the process of maintaining, preserving, figuring out how to, things that I don't understand about
Right.
collections and items, and how you make
Right.
sure that they're, clean and preserved and able to be kept for a very long time.
I appreciate that.
But
Thank you.
yes.
Yeah, I think it's a work in progress. As Tala said, the museum and a number of other organizations that are cultural organizations whose work it is to preserve and share the history and the culture of this community have been working to maintain the history and the memory of the 514 and 514 victims. And I think, she's right in saying, say their names. We should never allow it become one of these amorphous events that would happen and it impacted people. Well, we know who the people were. We know who their families were. We know what kind of people they were in terms of what they did and what was important to them. And so I think keeping that memory alive is really important in order for us to understand that this was a horrific event that, was impacted and felt by the community. And that's the community at large as well as the broad community in this country.
And our time always goes so quickly on the show, but we only have a couple minutes left. And so, Dr. Nevergold, you in the beginning, you started to talk about joy almost, right? And this resilience that has to be found. And so with only a couple minutes left, can you just kind of, give a nod to the future, right? You've done so much research as a historian. What do you want to leave folks with in terms of preserving this history?
What I want to leave folks with is an appreciation for the fact that history is made every day. History is made by people who are not big H history makers, but by little h history makers as well. And so let's appreciate the fact that we are all engaged in making history, and let's make our history the best that we can and leave a legacy for our children to follow and to be inspired by.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming on to What's Next. This has been an enlightening and amazing conversation. We look forward to keeping in touch, especially on that part 2, Tala. I would definitely want to maybe come back and have another conversation.
And just curious, Tala, so your other work, are you also doing other historical work and things along those lines?
It is, yeah. So part of the documentary, Ishmael Reed talks about the Little Harlem Hotel in Moonglow. I fell in love with the story of the Little Harlem Hotel, and my grandparents actually had their first date there.
Wow.
So I am discovering a process of historic preservation to somehow bring the Little Harlem Hotel back. People will be receiving emails, hint, hint, about how we're going to do that. So that's going to be my next project.
And are you putting updates on your social media about these types of work, or you kind of keep it?
I'm like, I used to be a social media manager. I don't even use my own social media. I need to. I will be getting back into that because this is something that needs to be published. So there are going to be separate pages created, like just for the documentary, just for the specific projects, that people get a glimpse of that and not all the rest of the other stuff that I do for other clients. But yeah.
Excellent.
Eventually.
Excellent. Well, our guests have been Lauren Kausner from the Buffalo History Museum, also Dr. Barbara Seals-Nevergold, and Tala Harden as well. We've been talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre and also tying in, I thought, very adeptly to what happened here in Buffalo on May 14th, 2022. I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Ekua Mends-Aidoo.
Support for WBFO and What's Next comes from our members and from Health Foundation for Western and Central New York, where racial and socioeconomic health equity are prioritized. Learn more about building healthier neighborhoods at hfwcny.org.